We're going on our third year of this case, the case of Bryan Kohberger. This is the suspect that was accused of killing 4 University of Idaho college students back in 2022. This was November 13th of 2022. Let's get an update from ABC News' Alex Stone.
Deep within a 70-page court filing, prosecutors say Bryan Kohberger's homework assignment from May of 2020 shows he has considerable knowledge of crime scenes and that he laid out what is essentially a how-to guide for police processing a murder scene. In it, he allegedly detailed a scene in which a white female had been found dead, how to avoid leaving fingerprints or other DNA that might contaminate a scene, and how to take investigative photos. He talked about defensive wounds, a bloody shirt, and multiple stab injuries. Kohberger is set to go on trial this summer. Alex Stone, ABC News.
Greg Skordas is filling in for Debbie Dujanovic today, Greg, and I was surprised. I guess I didn't realize it's been since 2022 that we've been following this case, and still there hasn't been a trial.
Yeah, this was a really gruesome case. 4 young University of Idaho students were killed in their dorm, in their apartment by someone. And the method of death was knife. They were all stabbed to death. There was a white car that was seen near the scene. There was an eyewitness. One of the other roommates said that she saw a man with a mask that had bushy eyebrows. There was a big investigation done. Importantly, there was a knife sheath that was left at the scene that had DNA on it, was traced to this Kohberger. He was arrested, I think, in Pennsylvania or something sometime afterwards, extradited to Idaho. He's standing trial there for these 4 homicides. Of course, it's a death penalty case because of the multiple homicides and because Idaho has a death penalty law, as we know from Chad Daybell. And it's set for trial. But there's just so many tweaks and turns to this case. He's got a very aggressive defense attorney who's challenging just about everything. It's a largely circumstantial case. We don't have an eyewitness except the bushy eyebrow thing,
right.
But that's hardly compelling evidence, although he does have bushy eyebrows, at least from the photos that we've seen of him. But every time we learn something new about this case, it just adds more to the mystery or mystique or maybe creepiness of the whole episode.
Speaking of the creepiness, we just saw a selfie that was taken. They've time-stamped this, and they have this selfie of him. Apparently, if this were the case, if he were the murderer, which it seems likely, if you look at this selfie, this was taken a matter of hours after the murders.
Yeah, and it's a weird selfie because he's alone, apparently. He's sitting or standing in front of a shower. You can see the shower head. His hair kind of looks wet. He's got earbuds on, and he's got this grin that sort of sends chills up your body, and he's doing the thumbs up thing. To me, if I were prosecuting this case, I would say this is his way of saying, I did it. I got away with this murder. He's given himself the thumbs up, and because he's several hours later, he hasn't been caught. There's no police chase. I think at that moment in time, if he did this, and he's presumed innocent, obviously, this selfie is him saying, I pulled it off. And we're now learning from what Alex Stone was talking about, that he actually wrote an article when he was a student. He studied criminal justice and about how to commit the perfect homicide and a white female, nothing left at the scene. I mean, it was almost a textbook example of what he's accused of doing now.
That is, in part, what is so compelling and terrifying and creepy about this story is this is an individual, I think he was a PhD candidate. He was educated. He would research, and he certainly seems to have had an obsession with true crime and the perfect crime and how to get away with it. And as they were looking at some of these past homework assignments and the direction he took, you can almost see the fingerprints on the murders that were committed and the homework assignment, almost like it was, am I figuring out or am I putting into practice the hypotheticals of my homework assignment?
Yeah, and there's been evidence coming out also about this 911 call that we've heard, in addition to the selfie, in addition to the knife sheath. But the 911 call is from another roommate who finds one of the victims, doesn't realize she's dead because the knife that was used here, Dave, was apparently so sharp that if you think about a surgical, what a doctor uses, it was so sharp that it didn't tear the skin in the way that you might expect. So there's not a lot of blood loss. So she sees her roommate laying there, not breathing, and thinks she's passed out or had some sort of episode. She's calling 911, not realizing, A, she's dead and she was murdered. There's no question she was murdered. It's just a matter of who did it. And that there are 3 other dead bodies in the apartment right next door, right in the next room, literally. So she's calling 911. The 911 operator is trying to be very factual, like, relax, you keep handing the phone to a different person. What's going on? Is the person breathing? Do they need CPR? She's trying to figure out what's going on, not realizing it was a quadruple homicide, which is about as bad as you could imagine. And these young kids, there's another sort of twist to this, and you hit it really well a minute ago. What's the motive? Why would he do this? Because there was no sexual assault to any of the victims. It didn't appear that there was any prior connection between Kohberger and the victims. He was angry at them or something like that. Is the motive, I can commit the perfect murder? And if so, how chilling. Just to do it, just to say I did it, just to be able to go through life going, I committed the perfect homicide.
It is such a sad story, the murders, and horrifying on so many levels. But this was a story where he was not immediately apprehended. I mean, this
took a while.
A fair amount of time of research and trying to unfold all the layers and possibilities. And when police started putting some of this together, and we know about cell phone data, but it seems like he turned off the phone when he was in the area. He was aware that, police are going to use
be pinged,
this.
right? You're going to be traced.
They had to go back, I believe it was a couple of weeks, and look at pings on cell phone towers to see if there were cars that didn't belong in this area. I mean, I cannot imagine the level of investigation it must have taken to be able to track down cars that didn't belong. And that's ultimately what they were able to find, is a car that didn't belong. It belonged to Kohberger. And then they were able to narrow down, find the suspect, and then, as you said, they found the sheath of the knife, and they were able to tie in DNA according to police. But it truly was one of those cases where you thought, this gruesome homicide, this quadruple homicide, this person may have gotten away with it.
Yeah, got very close, and may still. I mean, who knows? He's got a trial coming up, I think, in August. It's scheduled to go for 3 months, Dave. So the state must have a lot of evidence, and they need a lot of evidence because this is a death penalty case. You can't hold back. You can't not turn over every rock, not look behind every bush. I mean, the state has no choice but to pursue this with everything they've got. 3 months of trial, and the defense. I mean, I've prosecuted and defended death penalty cases in my career. The defense can leave nothing on the table either, because if you think about it, what's the result of losing the case? That is that their client could very well lose his life. And if he committed this crime, he probably will. So, I mean, both sides are looking at this as the World Series. This is as big as it gets in the criminal justice system, a death penalty case where the death penalty is on the table. And it got so much notoriety that it's actually been moved from northern Idaho, where it occurred, down to Boise, the biggest city in the state, because they thought that they couldn't get a fair jury up by the University of Idaho in the smaller county.
Does that explain why it's taken so long to bring this trial forth? I mean, this was, again, November 13th of 2022.
Right. So it'll be all of 3 years before it gets to trial. I don't think the change of venue made a huge difference in the timing of it. It was just putting the case together. Like you said a minute ago, it took a while to hook him up, to get him charged with the crime. It's a death penalty case, so there are a lot of motions that need to be filed, a lot of procedures that need to be filed. The state needs to provide everything they have. And a death penalty case, Idaho does it almost exactly as we do in Utah. They divide it into 2 phases. You've got the guilt phase, that is, did he do it? And then you've got the penalty phase. In our criminal justice system, The judge decides the punishment. If a person's convicted of crime, the judge decides it, with one exception, and that is a death penalty case where the jury decides the punishment. If you recall Chad Daybell, he was convicted in in the same courthouse there where this trial is going to go. They do the trial. He's found guilty. Then they go back to the jury and say, what do you want to do about it? It's rare in the criminal justice system that the jury has input into the punishment. The death penalty is the one instance where that occurs.
Does this 3 years that essentially it will take, does this cross any lines as far as like right to a speedy trial or what is considered a speedy trial?
Yeah, that's a good question. He certainly is entitled to a speedy trial, especially where he's incarcerated. If you're not in jail, speedy trial has a different meaning. But if you're sitting in jail and you're presumed innocent, yeah, you want a speedy trial. But his attorneys also want to make sure that he gets a fair trial, and they're probably part of the reason it's taken so long, because they're saying there's thousands of pages of documents. We need to read those. There's a DNA test. We need to see that. We need to have our expert look at the DNA. We have to have our expert look at the evidence. So I would assume that he's not complaining and standing and pounding the podium saying, I want my speedy trial. I would submit his attorneys are probably saying, we need a little more time to go through this case so that we can try it right.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. This was obviously one of the huge stories of 2022, the manhunt trying to track down the killer, and now we're at the trial phase of it 3 years later, or 2.5 years later. Let's talk about another story, the Lori Daybell case. This was another thing here in Utah that, or with ties to Utah, that it's kind of hard to keep track, because as we were peeling back all these layers, you start realizing the murders, the multiple murders, the conspiracy, the back and forth, the married to Chad Daybell. I mean, where are we at with Lori Daybell right now? Because Chad Daybell was convicted in Idaho. Death penalty case as well, sentenced to death.
Right, exactly. And his case is, of course, on appeal. Lori, I sort of know her as Lori Vallow, but Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted in Idaho also. Her trial went before Chad's. They didn't pursue the death penalty in her case, Dave, because she had some mental health issues, and there was some issues about whether the state had given the defense enough evidence to proceed with the death penalty, and so they just went to trial on her case. She was convicted of multiple homicides, I think 3, and some insurance fraud, other things like that in Idaho. That case is over. She's done, except for the appeals. She's then been extradited to Arizona, where she's facing another homicide case, and this one involves, I think, Charles Daybell, her former husband. She's been accused of a homicide there too.
Charles Vallow.
Charles Vallow. I'm sorry.
It's
yes.
hard to keep track.
Yeah, right. No. You're right. Vallow. And so that trial's going forward, and the strangest thing has happened, and that is that she's now saying, I would like to represent myself in the Charles Vallow case. That's something. This is America. You can represent yourself. I mean, you can't represent me because you're not an attorney, but you can represent yourself whether you're an attorney or not.
So obviously, would be the reason behind representing yourself? Are there arguments to be made of I mean, obviously there's a little bit of a bias, being an attorney, but are there times and places where it makes sense? And I mean, obviously with something of this magnitude, I can't imagine any argument for it. But what are your thoughts on just representing yourself in general?
Let me just tell you, I've actually done 2 trials where my client represented himself. And I was appointed by the court as what's called standby counsel. Both of these individuals were sort of constitutionalists. They felt that they could do a better job, and they said, I want to represent myself. The judge admonished them, you're nuts. This is a foolish thing to do. There's the old saying that, the person who represents himself has a fool for a client. That's an understatement. It's a completely, I don't know. It's not a smart thing to do. She'll have standby counsel too. I guarantee it. Somebody that can just sit there and advise her about the rules of evidence and object to this and don't do that. But she has the right to represent herself. She's chosen to do that. We know she has some mental health issues. If you recall, in Idaho, there was a period of time when she was incompetent. She couldn't even go to trial, and that her case was stayed for about a year until her competency was restored. So I'm sure that the judge in Arizona is going to go through a very thorough examination and have doctors examine her and say, is she even competent to make the decision to represent herself? But yes, in America, an accused has the right to represent themselves, and that's an absolute right, and the court cannot override that absent some evidence that they're not competent to make that decision.
So as she goes down to Arizona, and is there any leniency or understanding, or how do judges handle this? If I would imagine if you're representing yourself, you're making procedural errors left and right.
Every day, right, every hour. Judges don't like pro se litigants, people who are representing themselves, because then the judge has to step in and believe it or not, the judge will make objections, not necessarily I object, but might say, I'm not going to allow that evidence to come in. Whereas normally the attorney would say, objection, that's hearsay. The judge might jump in and say, to preserve the integrity of the trial, I'm not going to let that in because it's hearsay. I'm not going to let that in because it's prejudicial. I'm not going to let that in because it's irrelevant. The judge has to make those decisions because he or she has a pro se litigant, a non-law trained person who's trying a murder case, and you have to make sure that that person, even though they're their own attorney, so to speak, is competent, is making good decisions. And even the prosecutor has to dial it back a little bit because they don't want to try this case twice and say, well, she shouldn't have represented herself. The Arizona Supreme Court kick it back and say, you got to try it again. So they're going to make sure that they've done everything right. She's completely advised to the right to have counsel. She's completely advised that she doesn't even have to pay for it. She'll get court-appointed counsel. She'll get skilled counsel, somebody that knows what they're doing, and that she's making a huge mistake, but that it's her right. And then during the trial, they will also make sure that the rules of evidence are followed closely and that the state doesn't take advantage of somebody that doesn't know the rules by getting evidence in that they normally couldn't have.
Oftentimes you will see somebody that has been found guilty. They will, on their appeal, come back and say, my counsel didn't represent me properly, or I had inefficient or poor counsel.
Right.
And that's one of the areas where you can appeal, or I've seen appeals in the past. If you're a pro se, is that what you call it? Pro se.
You can't argue that you were ineffective representing yourself.
I think you probably could. You could say, well, you should have pushed back harder. I didn't realize how difficult it was, or whatever it is.
If you've ever seen the colloquy of a judge addressing a person who wants to represent themselves, I've seen hours spent by judges saying, you really, really, really need to think about this. So that judge in Arizona will absolutely do that. And if she appeals saying, hey, you should have warned me not to do this, they're going to play an hour tape to the Arizona Supreme Court saying, what are you talking about? We told you not to do this.
Clear as day. So Lori Vallow has already been convicted of murder of her children, JJ and Tylee, is now being prosecuted for the death of her. I can't remember if this is the first husband. I believe it was the first husband, Charles Vallow. And I guess wherever the murders happen, they get tried. And if there were murders in multiple states and multiple murders, each one gets its own trial.
Yeah, and I was a little bit surprised that the Arizona court and prosecution wanted to try her because her conviction in Idaho, Dave, would mean she would never get out of prison.
Yes.
But Arizona decided to pursue it anyway, and my guess is it's because they want to make sure that even if she appeals in Idaho, and even if she prevails on that appeal in Idaho, that they've got a second bite of the apple, that they're going to go after her as well, and they're going to make sure she never sees the light of day. So we've got two jurisdictions, both going to end up with a life sentence probably, and go ahead and appeal all you want, Lori. You're not going anywhere.